must be something interesting in the Cal-Aggie today. Everybody's reading it. And speaking of reading, your next reading assignment is chapter 15, which is vineyard cultivation, weed control, etc., which we are going to try to cover today. But I suggest you read it, and one of these days I want to carry out this threat to give you a quiz. But I'm not sure it can be Monday after picnic day. Tim Mondavi is here. Is Tim Mondavi here? Dr. Levy, you want to make an announcement about that party, or what do we? Here he comes. Tim, you tell him about it. I just asked him for you. Yeah, about this work party and all that.
Well, I made an announcement already the party's going to be Friday afternoon at 5 on. We need people to help out doing things, so I'd appreciate if you could contact me. And the important part of the planning aspect is to have people signed up early enough so that we can count on the number of people that are going to be there. And so I appreciate if you could sign up either with me or with Susan in the department office as soon as possible. It's $250 a head, and bring yourself and your wife, husband, whatever.
Well, you've got to know how many heads are coming on it. Yeah. What's the deadline?
We're not like get enough beer and get enough chicken and all that.
Well, when's the deadline?
It's well, I've said Thursday noon.
Thursday noon?
All right. It's going to sooner than that, so I kind of get a strategy now.
Okay. Okay, those of you who've had the Monday and Tuesday lab have had the talk by Mr. Tyree on vineyard equipment, and today we want to talk a little bit about vineyard cultivation and in general weed control. But the title is vineyard cultivation because most vineyards get cultivated sooner or later, more or less. And how much in many cases is how much spare time the grower has. Jim Leiter, Dr. Lloyd Leiter's brother, is farm advisor in Napa County, or was until a couple of years ago, and he had a lot to do with slowing down the amount of cultivation the growers are doing over there, because it was really true that those growers sitting in their house all winter long, the first day it got dry enough, they got on their tractor and started cultivating. And he used to go out, stop his car, and ask them why they were cultivating. And they said, because they didn't have anything else to do. And that was a true statement, even though it sounded like a joke. And remember, when I was showing you those slides, that slide series on planting vines all the way through, I showed you where the tractor was working, but where the water table was 2 feet, which gives you some idea of what sort of damage you're doing to the soil by getting out there too early to cultivate. Well, we're going to non-irrigation cultivation in a moment, but the point is that I want to make is that, like I was talking about summer pruning, you don't want to cultivate unless there's a reason for it. And you've got to have a reason, because the more you cultivate the soil, no matter how careful you are, the more you break down the natural soil structure. And eventually you get into the problems that we have in the San Joaquin Valley, where even though they have a rather light appearing soil that looks like water just ought to go right through it, just boom, you can't get water penetration because you've broken down all the natural soil structure, all the granules, all the natural separations, and just essentially made a powder out of it. Either made a powder out of it by destroying the structure, or else by cultivating when the soil is too wet, you create a plow pan. And if you looked over those old midterms, once again, you've got another difference between a plow pan and a hard pan. The plow pan is a compacted zone created by you by unwise cultivation with extra heavy equipment, or when the soil is too wet, and cultivating to a more or less a given depth year after year, so that you can develop this rather impervious zone by excessive cultivation. So you have two effects. You get the plow pan 6 or 8 inches down, which is compacted, which prevents root growth, and then you break down the natural soil structure on the surface soils so that the water can't get its normal penetration. These soils are funny, especially in the San Joaquin Valley. Some of you may or may not have ever been to the Kearney Field Station, where we have 200 acres or so. The soil looks nice and sandy, but by repeated water penetration measurements, we get water penetrating at about 1/10 of an inch an hour. And according to the weather station, that's almost exactly what it evaporates from a, from a free surface. So we're not sure it's going in at all. If the penetration rate's 1/10 of an inch an hour, and the evaporation rate is 1/10 of an inch an hour, where are you getting? Which really leads me, which when we get around discussing irrigation, to wonder if we really need as much water as we say we do in our California vineyards, or whether we're just evaporating into the sky. But more about that later. Anyway, the point is, to sum this up, that you want to do the minimum amount of cultivation that is required. And why is it required? Of course, obviously, the #1 reason for cultivation is the control of weeds. And in a way, this is the only way in which cultivation conserves moisture. There used to be a long-standing idea that what you wanted to do was to work up the surface of the soil and create a dust mulch, as they call it, so that you don't get evaporation of water. Well, under a normal condition of soil, which has no weeds on it at all, the way you lose moisture, of course, is evaporation to the surface, and the way the moisture moves up is through capillaries. But these capillaries, to exaggerate a little bit, go like this. They may be wide down here, but then they finally get down to being very thin and finally break. And of course, the capillary that breaks no longer moves water upward. So if you just don't touch the soil at all and have no weeds or any plants on it, it will eventually dry out down 4 to 6 inches or so. But below that, after these capillaries are broken, you don't get much upward movement of water, whether you cultivate it or not. Now, if you go in and cultivate it and stir up this top 6 inches or so, actually, you're not doing much, because if you just left it alone, it'd be all right. But what you do is, when you stir it up like this, you not only waste all that energy, time, effort, and so forth, but you may take some soil that's fairly moist from here and bring it up to the top. So you can really lose some moisture by stirring it up repeatedly and drying out moist soil by exposing it to the air. So the old wives' tale, or the old farmer's tale, that putting on a dust mulch helps to conserve moisture is false. A little bit of data, which I happen to see here, in a paper which I'm not going to bother to quote now, in a tank, in a pair of tanks with soil in them, one which had weeds, morning glory to be exact, lost 120 pounds of water. 120 pounds of water was lost in 23 days, where they had the morning glories growing. In a tank just like it, with no weeds and no disturbing of the soil at all, it lost 57 pounds of water in 4 years. So weeds, of course, will suck the water out. And a lot of you have asked me what you saw on the old exams and so forth, what's so bad about morning glory in the vineyard. I said it looked pretty. It does. But the root system is it has a deep root system, and it goes right down where the grape roots are. And it sucks the water out right in the zone where the grape root has to compete for it in these non-irrigated coastal vineyard soils. Okay, that's the main reason why you cultivate. But there's lots of other little reasons. Of course, you've got to cultivate to put in irrigation furrows, make the ridges, and then in the San Joaquin Valley where you have to irrigate 4 or 6 times, quite often after most of the irrigations, or every now and then you've got to cultivate once again to get rid of the weeds. And then you've got to re-furrow and all this. But that's rather obvious. Another reason for cultivating, is one you haven't thought about much, is for raisin preparation, or raisin drying. I say you hadn't thought about this because you're not aware of it, but in raisin drying, remember when I was talking about east and west vines and all this, I said that you pick we're looking at it now, let's see, we're looking at it from the east side, so you pick the grapes from this vine and you lay them on a tray over here. That isn't very much of a tray, is it? It looks like a box. But anyway, you lay them over here, put it that way, so that you get the most of this late summer sun coming on the raisins. But they're laid on paper trays, and the paper tray, of course, has to be put on very smooth, flat surface. So they cultivate the vineyard before harvest, a couple of weeks before harvest, because you want that surface soil completely dry. You don't want to cultivate it today and pick tomorrow and put a paper tray down on it. It'll get wet and be a mess. So they cultivate a couple of weeks in advance, and they drag this smooth, just as smooth as you see the soil under almond trees for picking up almonds. And then usually they slope it just a little bit like this, so that they get a little bit more advantage of this exposure. And in case they do get any rain, hopefully the rain will drain away from their paper trays. So this is a very important cultivational operation in the preparation of raisins. And one of the biggest crimes you can make, if you're an amateur and don't know what you're doing, is to visit some guy's vineyard after he's got this nicely set up and go tramping down through the middle of it with your big feet going plop, 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 making big holes where he's going to have to put the trays. So if you ever visit such a vineyard, for granted sake, walk over here to the side so that you leave this part nice and flat for your raisin trays. An important probably the second most important reason for cultivation of grapes in California. And then, of course, you got, I say, lots of these other little reasons. If you're, in spite of my big long sermon, if you're still insisting on planting a cover crop, you're going to have to cultivate to plant it. And then if you plant it, you're going to have to plow it under the next spring, incorporate it. Whether you plant it or not, you usually got to do some spring cultivation to get rid of the weeds and get set up for the summer. Maybe even cultivate early to prevent frost injury. Remember, you want a clean, bare, moist, firm surface for the most frost protection you can get. And then, of course, finally, perhaps, is to say that in some cases it helps to cultivate to increase the absorption of water. Now, that may sound odd, but in the coastal counties, on the hillsides and so forth, if you don't cultivate it and break it up into sort of if you got a slope like this, and if you don't break it up into sort of jagged furrows like this, a lot of the water will run off. And then, strange as it may seem, and I'll mention it later when I get to herbicides, in the coastal counties, if you use herbicides and don't cultivate, for some reason the soil seals up and you cannot get good water penetration. I'll show you some slides and tell you more about that in a moment, but in our work at Oakville, we found with herbicides that where we treated the entire soil surface with herbicides for several years, it just practically sealed up tight. So that you need, and I don't quite understand all I know about this, because in Southern California, it's quite common practice to use herbicides in orange groves, and they have no problem with water penetration. But these coastal soils of ours, for some reason, maybe it's because we get more rainfall, and it just sort of beats it into the ground and seals it over. I don't know why. But we found that we could not successfully continue to grow grapes without some breaking up of the soil for water penetration in unirrigated vineyards. Okay, that gives you some idea then of some of the reasons for cultivating. Obviously, in the non-irrigated vineyards, where weeds are going to compete with the vines for water, whether they're morning glories or what have you, or mustard plants. Now we're going to go into the seasonal comparisons, seasonal procedure for cultivation. And in these non-irrigated vineyards, you've got to get every bit of the weeds, all the weeds out of them if you're going to have non-irrigated vineyards. And the problem is, the big question is, when do I cultivate? And of course, that's what I say about when I was talking about Jim Leiter and the growers who didn't have anything else to do. Sometimes they get out thinking that this is the last rain. So let's get out as soon as it gets dry and cultivate them under and save all the soil moisture we can. But all too often it is not the last rain, so that they've done that cultivation, and when it rains again, they've got to go and cultivate again. But generally speaking, you try to get into the coastal county non-irrigated vineyards as soon as you think the last rain is over, and disc them. And that's where this business of square planting with no wires really has its advantage, because if you cross-cultivate, and for some reason I've lost my cross-cultivation slide, if you cross-cultivate and are really good with a tractor and disc in both directions, you can disc out practically all the weeds with just leaving a very few around each vine, with just a good job, an expert discer, man with a disc, whatever that's called. And then if you do get another rain a little later on, the thing to do is you go through this time and just take a very light harrow. For the foreign students, a harrow is a disc, a spike device, and then just barely scratch the surface to get rid of the weeds which pop up with the last 1 inch of rain that you might get. And then that's all the cultivation you do in the non-irrigated vineyards. If you have morning glory, you may have to go back in later on. If you're afraid to use 2,4-D, you might have to go back in later and disc it to try to discourage it a little bit at least. As I say, most of the coastal new vineyards that are going in on trellises, and that means then that you're either going to have to use the French plow, which you have seen demonstrated in the vineyard, and I'll show you some slides in a moment, or just keep discing it, or have your nerve and try to use 2,4-D carefully. Okay, but now in the irrigated vineyards of the San Joaquin Valley, we have what we call the spring cleanup, and this means that that they usually, the first thing that's usually done is to French plow if you're using cultivation. In a moment I'm going to give you alternatives, of course, with herbicides, but to use the French plow. And when you French plow, this means you throw the soil away from the vine, and normally this is followed by an irrigation, a good pre-growth soaking irrigation in the French plow furrow under the vine. And if you really have fertilizer problems, potash, or as nitrogen gets more scarce, maybe we have to put nitrogen there also, it may be a good time to apply your fertilizer into that French plow furrow. Certainly that's why we did it when we were trying to find out whether or not we could get response for phosphorus. And we got nice uptake of phosphorus, but we didn't get any response on the crop, as you recall. And then, of course, after that, they throw that dirt back. They've thrown it away now. Then they throw the dirt back, and then disc the middles good. and then set up for the forest for irrigation. And then, of course, how often you have to cultivate after that depends, again, on personal preference. But in most cases, in many cases, especially with Emperor and some of these colored varieties, or table grape varieties, they like to let weeds grow in the late summer to control the water. Remember, so that you can slow the water down, slow down the growth of the vine, and get a little bit better quality of fruit, and at the same time cut down something on the dust problem and the dirt problem, which will be on the clusters. Since you're not going to be able to wash those clusters, you want to cut down as much dust as possible, so a little cover crop doesn't hurt them. But in our work at Kearney, comparing all these various operations, which I'm hoping to cover with you this morning, one of our treatments has been continuous cover crop. That is, we don't plow it under at all. We just mow it, just cut it. And to our amazement, we found out that it really does soak up the nitrogen, because even though we put on 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and all the other plots, of course, the other treatments were okay, but 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre will not take care of even a measly continuous growing cover crop in an area that already has some nitrogen in the water. So if you decide you're going to go continuous cover crop, you've got to really watch this nitrogen factor and maybe do what I've told you not to do, that is, raise it from 50 pounds to 100 pounds per acre to take care of a continuous cover crop requirement. Okay, let's look at a few pictures then of cultivation here, because I think you may be getting confused with my talking about both of these things. See, you folks, see if you can get those curtains down. This is the difficulty of this room. I knew it before we came into it. This morning sun. You have to pull it toward me. Okay, you want to get the lights there, please? Okay, see, this is quite a sort of scene that you often get in the San Joaquin Valley, a pretty heavy cover crop. I think these are horse beans, but you get that type of mess that you got to get rid of. One of the reasons for cultivation. So this is the type of thing you get. Next slide, please. And or even if you plant cover crop only in the middles of the row. This is planted vetch and barley in the middle here. You still got to get rid of it. And next slide. And even when you do that, sometimes you wind up with something that looks like this. You know, it must be that lens is dirty or something, because we never had so much trouble with sharp focusing, but that might be better. Okay, we might check that, Mark, later on to see if that lens is dirty, because we keep getting all these real poor focus slide. Okay, so you got this type of problem to get rid of, even though you disc the middles. Okay, how are we going to handle it? Well, this is the instrument. Again, it has to be focused for some reason. Here we go. And this is the French plow that Mr. Tyree showed you Monday and Tuesday, and hopefully, or did he yesterday? Didn't have it yesterday? Yeah, I tried to, I couldn't understand why in the world they had to take it to Napa Valley yesterday when we need it for class. Why they couldn't wait till Thursday. Wait a minute, back up. Yeah, the vines will die. But this is the French plow, and as I say, this is a bar that pulls the plow in and out of the vine row, and you'll get it demonstrated and discussed out in class, if not this week, next week. These things cost about $800 or so. This is a Lakem plow, made down near Fresno, and actually I think that there won't be many more made because we're going to go to more and more to herbicides in the vine row. But anyway, this is the plow, and I'm always amazed at something like that, which is only that, will cost $800 or $1,000. But anyway, next slide. And this shows it in action. It's supposed to. And you can see it here in the vine row. The next slide will show a little better shot, I think. Maybe with this little projector, maybe we're too far back. That may be what's causing it. And this shows the close-up of the action in which this plow with the bar here to pull it out, to keep from wiping out the stake and the vine at the same time. It goes in and out of the vine row, zigzag in and out of the vine row to pull your weeds out. Next slide. And this shows the result with a good job of it done. You see, if you go down both sides of it, and with a good operator, you can practically wipe out every weed. You may wipe out a few vines occasionally too, with what we call cultivator blight. But with older vines and with good stakes, good strong stakes, you can do a real nice job, even on our fairly heavy Davis soil. And with a nice sandy soil, so San Joaquin Valley, it does an excellent job. They pull the dirt out like this, say then you irrigate down this middle, then you throw the dirt back in with a disc, and then you've got it taken care of from then on you just worry about the middles. Next slide. And this shows, of course, the end job of disking down the middle without, of course, this doesn't combine the French plow and the disking, but if you imagine it, then this has been French plowed, and then you disc it down the middle, and then in the coastal counties, you're through for the year, unless you do get another little late rain later on, which I say you would do some harrowing. Okay, next slide. But this shows the real way to handle weeds. You guys shouldn't sit here, you should sit over there so you can see. This shows the way to handle weeds under the new system. And this is herbicide treatment in the coastal valley. And if you do it rightly and correctly, you can control the weeds so sharply and so neatly that you just can't believe it, even when you see the slide. See, this is mustard. Wild mustard is probably waist high, and yet in this vine row of 3 feet or so along the vine, they've been able to completely wipe out the weeds. And on older vines, with vines that are 3 or 4 years old, this is the way to go.
What type of buildup you get in the soil?
Okay, let's have this. Wait a minute. Let's have the lights in. Turn off for a moment. We'll discuss herbicides. What was your question?
What type of buildup do you get in those herbicides?
Well, most of the herbicides will decompose certainly within the one growing season. Some of them decompose almost too quickly. Is a problem. So let's talk about those for a moment then. See what we get to. So. We get away then from this idea of using cultivation, and certainly in these non-irrigated vineyards, and talk about the idea of using chemical control. Originally the controls were oil, and this work was just being done when World War II started. The price of oil at that time, like it is now, went way up, and the people quit using it. So then nothing much was done about using oil controls until we got into this modern era of chemical weed control. And this business of giving the lecture on weed control becomes quite a problem. As I told some of you in the 5 o'clock session, that many of the subjects we're going to discuss this quarter and try to cover in an hour are offered in 3, 4, 5, 6 unit courses on the campus. You can take a 4-unit weed control course or a 2-unit weed control course. And we're just going to try to hit the very basic principles in 15 or 20 minutes. If you want the complete works, then go take the course. Here we're just going to try to get across the main idea, because this whole business of weed control is moving so fast that they've got a new one out between now and 5 o'clock. And then you never know which ones of those or when, if ever, they're going to be registered and permitted for use in California. so that we can only hit on the basic idea, basic principle of weed control and show you a little bit of what goes on. And we have 3 general types of weed control, of chemicals, excuse me. We have the contact killers, in which they just kill any green foliage that is sprayed. And basically, I don't know what's so wonderful about those, because you could use sulfuric acid and be all right. It might be a little more dangerous to use with the equipment, but the net effect would be the same as if you use sulfuric acid, which what's his name in botany came out with 30 years ago. The contact killers, I'll think of it in a moment. Or you have seed sterilants, which really kill not seeds but young germinating seeds. And then you have the third type, which are translocated. That is, they're picked up by the foliage and moved throughout the entire plant to the root system. So these are the 3 basic types of weed killers. Even though you name the 40 or 50 different types of herbicides and whatnot are put out, they work under one or the other or a combination of those 3 principles of seed sterilant, germinating seed sterilants, or contact killer, or translocated. So I mentioned some of these when we were talking about establishing the vineyard. To give you some idea of some of them, for example, the ones that are translocated, the best example, of course, of all is 2,4-D. That's our very best example of that for vineyard purposes. This is the one that is used specifically, of course, to kill morning glory. We have Dalapon. Now you've got to know these 3 basic principles, and you've got to give me an example of each one of these types of chemicals. And 2,4-D is used on morning glory, and Dalapon is used on Bermuda grass and Johnson grass.
How did you know that it's not going to be translocated in the vine? Is it used during the winter?
What's this?
How do you know that it's not going to be translocated in the vine?
How do we know it's not going to be? Oh, in the vine? Well, I told you when we were talking about establishing the vineyard that the only bad thing about 2,4-D that it was just as bad on the vine as it is on the morning glory. I've told you that 2 or 3 times now. I tell you that you have to be extremely careful putting on 2,4-D because the vine is more sensitive than the morning glory, or just as sensitive. So you have to be extremely careful and cautious in its use. I told you this, but I'll repeat it again, that in order to get 2,4-D on, they even make it up in big wax bars that are 3 or 4 inches, 3 inches so in diameter, and 3 feet or so long, and drag it to the vineyard to rub it on the vines, or on the morning glory. That's it. You cannot get on the green foliage. It isn't a matter of you don't put on enough. If you're going to use 2,4-D, you put it on at something like 0.1% solution. So you have to practically bathe the vine in it and the root system in it to get that much into the root system. It's a matter of getting it on the foliage. Use a what? Well, this is the other way to put it on, is using the bar, or else use a very low pressure sprayer with a drape around it, with a drape that just lets it dribble onto the foliage practically. But even then, you get some vaporization and some burn. But I'll show you a slide or two to show you that you can control it if you... Did I bring that slide or not? I don't know whether it's in the series or not. I laid it out, but I think I left it out too. That you can, if you're intelligent and careful and know what you're doing, you can use 2,4-D in your vineyard and control morning glory pretty well with it, with practically very little damage to the vines. But it's such a scary word to the grower, it's almost like cancer and heart attack. People are just afraid to use it, but it can be used. And Dalapon is used, I say, on Bermuda and Johnson grass. But if you recall when I was telling you about establishing the vineyard, I say what you got to do in both cases is make those two grasses think that they've got it made, get them growing real nice and succulent, and then sock it to them. And then they'll die back some, and then you wait, let them come back again, and let them get growing again nice and succulent, and hit them again. Because you need that nice, green, excellent foliage to absorb enough material to be translocated to the root zone to kill them all. So you need young growing leaves, which are really good absorbing agents, in order to get the chemical into the root system. Okay, then, so those are your two best examples. We have, this is, I don't know how many of these to talk about, but well, those are the only two I'm going to give you, because say we can give you a dozen of them here, but there's no point. We have others like atrazine and so forth that have been were used at one time, but now are no longer permitted. So on this. Now let's go up here to seed sterilants. I don't know why I'm working backwards on this, but we get to seed sterilants, and of course our best ones here are Carmax, and Simazin. And it's a mixture of these two that you just saw in that first slide that works so well in the coastal counties, because these are, say, are seed sterilants, and unfortunately Simazin will kill. There's a few plants in which Simazin won't work on the seeds, and a few plants in which Carmax won't work. So the best thing to do is to put a mixture of the two on. And you put on a mix of these, and you can do a pretty good job. If, of course, obviously, since they work on germinating seeds, you've got to get them on before weeds start to grow in this wintertime. You've got to get them on before the first rain, because once the plants are up 3 inches high, 6 inches high, you're not going to have these chemicals work on germinating seeds. So you've got to know which chemical you're using and why. So those are two good examples. We usually put those on, to say, in the late fall, just before the first winter rains, to take care of germinating seeds. And then we have, as an example of contact, by far of all, the best example of this one is paraquat. And you see this advertised a lot in Wines and Vines, in the American Grape Grower, or the Grape Grower, and so forth, as the chemical hoe. And it really is a chemical hoe. Paraquat, I say, it kills any green foliage that it touches. It's a wonderful material because it's relatively safe to humans on skin contact, at least, unless you're going to drink it. I read something recently about some children who had drunk some of it, so that's why I say it. But it's relatively safe, and yet it kills plant growth just like concentrated acid. You spray that material on, and in 24 hours the plant's dying, or all the green foliage is dying. You'll see it used some around Davis, around lawns. I use it around my lawn and so forth. And to bore, you can take a sprayer with a wedge spray instead of a cone spray, and you can trim your lawn with it. Just as neat as can be, because it acts just like a chemical hoe. And this is a nice material to use in vineyards to kill any spot weeds that you see. Once you get them under control with these seed sterilants and so forth, or wipe out your Bermuda grass with Dalapon what was the other one I gave you? 2,4-D and Dalpon. Then you can go in and then just spot treat with a paraquat. And it's a real good material, but it is not a translocatable material. It kills only the top surface. So if you've got morning glories or something like that, you can kill them off nicely. You just kill off the top. You can do the same thing with a hoe. So it's a chemical hoe, but the morning glory will come right back, unless you put on 2,4-D to translocate into the root system. You got a question, or are you just holding them?
Yeah. When you recommend these, how young the vines can be before you can...
Okay, we'll get to it. Okay, I said that there's a lot of wonderful things here, but there's also a few drawbacks. Okay, a few comments to make then. On 2,4-D, if you want to get the best results, you wait until it's blooming and almost going to seed. Because the work that's been done in the botany department shows that 2,4-D moves with the carbohydrates. And at this time of year, right now, to spray morning glory, the carbohydrates are moving out of the reserve root system up to the top, just as the vines are doing. So if you spray with 2,4-D right now, you won't get too much results. But wait about another month when the plant's beginning to slow down a little bit from this very active growth period and beginning to send carbohydrates down into that terrible reserve root system, which causes it to persist so long, and then put the 2,4-D on for a free ride and let it go into the root system, and then you've got it. So you've got to spray 2,4-D when the carbohydrate is moving downward. Okay, and then as I said on this business of Dalpon, you've got to use it at a time when the plant's growing luxuriantly, and then hit it at that time. We used to have one called aminotriazole, or amitrole. Now, this is just for the few foreign students. Amitrole does the same thing, but some of the food scare people in the United States have taken it off the market in the United States, but it's used a lot in Mexico and in Europe. We have MSMA, which is another MSMA, which some of you may have heard about. It's ideal for Johnson grass. Again, a translocatable type, but it's not permitted in the U.S. It's permitted in Europe and places like that think that they're going to be poisoned if they drink Concord wine, but they'll use MSMA arsenic on their weed control on their vineyards. That's a dig at the Germans. You know that they will not permit the importation of American species type wines because they say that it'll give them cancer. But they'll use MSMA, which is an arsenical material, to spray on their weeds, but we can't use that. Well, I got off the subject. We were talking about paraquat and its wonderful contact killing ability. Remember, it's just a lazy man substitute for a hoe, because it will kill any green tissue it touches. It won't bother the brown dormant trunks of the vines. It can be used nicely and easily, but you can use a hand hoe just as easy. I mean, just as effectively, but not as easy.
Generally, what quantity of that 2,4-D and that money?
Well, we're not going to go into the great details of how much to apply of each one. I'm trying to give you just a basic principle. I said 2,4-D is usually 0.1%, and paraquat, I think, is a pint per 100 gallons or something, or maybe it's a quart per 100 gallons. But you can get all those out of the recommendations, and if I can get to it, maybe I can find a handout to give you. I think I can get you enough reprints to give you the basic principles, the basic treatments of most of these materials. So we have that type of thing. And then we get around to another one. Now we want to talk a little bit about damage. Most of these materials, as I say, paraquat doesn't hurt any green tissue. But Carmex and Simazin, the general recommendation is, certainly for Carmex, that you never use it until the vines are 3 years old. So what do you use in the first 3 years? And generally, the general recommendation has been don't use any herbicides in the first 3 years. But once again, with a little intelligent care and supervision, you can use simazine or Treflan in the first 2 or 3 years of the vineyard life. Treflan is probably at the moment our safest registered, that is permitted, material to use in the vineyard. So you can use Treflan in those first several years, because down at Kearney we put on simazine and Treflan starting in the first year, but we put on very, very low rates, something like a half a pound of simazine and a pound of Treflan per acre. And that's the last thing I want to show those slides. The last thing I want you to get in your note is what we mean by a sprayed acre, because this causes more trouble than any other thing in the whole herbicide world. A sprayed acre, because most of the herbicide people never explain what a sprayed acre is. When they say to put on 3 pounds or something per sprayed acre, they mean we're only going to spray, 4 feet, then we're going to skip 8 feet, and then spray the next 4 feet. So when they say sprayed acre, that means, see, this is 1/3 of the surface is sprayed. So a sprayed acre is 3 acres of vineyard. A sprayed acre is 3 acres of planted vineyard. And boy, I've seen some vineyard damage done in Mexico where people don't understand that, and it says to put on 4, 6, or 8 pounds per sprayed acre, and that means that if they don't understand it, they put on 3 times as much as they're supposed to. A sprayed acre is the actual acreage covered with the spray. Now, if you don't get anything else out of this course, get that, because there's more damage caused by that than anything I know of. That when you read those directions on the bag, it means the actual acreage of ground that is wetted with a spray. Okay, I hate to leave those slides. Let's go through them real quick here, just to, you guys can wait another 3 minutes, since I got them all together. Okay, this is the way it works. Here's another shot of Napa Valley at our Oakville vineyard, showing the Carmex and simazine mix and the way it works. We leave the cover crop in the middle and spray here. This gives you some frost protection. Also, of course, does away with the French plow. Next slide. Just another shot showing that, again, how neatly and cleanly this stuff works. Next slide. But here's the complete clean cultivation, where I told you that we had to do away with, because this seals over and we don't get water penetration. So this idea is not recommended to go complete scorch the earth business. Stay in the vine row only. Next slide. And this is, of course, here at Davis. Shows you this mound under the vines with, again, a nice clean cultivation cover crop. You can work this up quickly with a disc, work it here with the weed control, and you got it. Next slide. And here's a typical scene now in the San Joaquin Valley. This is completely undisturbed, just sprayed every year, and then quickly and easily disc down the middles. Next. And here's where it really pays, in the coastal counties, on these hillside vineyards where it's almost impossible to get around them with equipment. You can spray these terrace vineyards in the vine row with herbicide, and then, of course, disc the flat part in between. And this is, okay, let's stop there, right there, because we are out of time, and I want to talk some more about the disadvantages of herbicide next time.